Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back. First things first, before we get started, so impressed with y'all. So proud of y'all. Absolutely in love with the hard work that y'all did on Penny Wars, uniting your class together, raising money for charity. It's absolutely a beautiful thing, right? So no matter what, win, lose, or draw, I just want to say that I am so proud of y'all, that I plan on bringing y'all in rewards and things like that for all of your hard work up to this point. And again, also, I'm so excited about how many of you are really engaged in this crazy French Revolution story, right? So I love the fact that it's clicking and some kids know it already and we're like actually vibing off of each other a lot and we're really figuring this thing out together, right? And so where we left off in class speaking about the French Revolution, right, and the Penny Wars revolution that will be our like giant grand like call to action if need be. So the big thing though going into it is you have to understand that we did talk about a lot of different things before this, right? So the things we talked about before this, we talked about like, you know, the revolution itself, images of the revolution that still exist with us today, including liberty caps and like tricolor cockades and stuff like that, which I personally think that we should all get cockades and just wear them around school and stuff like that and be like, we support the revolution that is going to like take place any day now. Y'all are like the bourgeois basically, right? So now the big thing about that, we also talked about the crumbling ancient regime, right? We talked about the fact that the ancient regime is leading to bigger disparities, right? That ancient regime being the clergy, the nobles, the everybody else, right? We talked about how 99% of the taxes were paid by 98% of the people, but the most of the wealth was actually like held inside of the first and second estate. So there was a very, very unfair tax system. Sounds familiar. Now, the big thing about it, though, going into it, we talked about how that basic belief is that the third estate is versus everyone else, and that's not necessarily true. It's actually progressive-minded people versus non-progressive-minded people. We'll actually get a chance to talk about that a little bit today, right? So we also discussed as well a little bit, we started talking about the big place where we left off in class was the eroded power of the monarchs, right? So that's the second big cause that we talked about. We talked about how when Louis XIV died, the intendant system kind of started to fall off a little bit, right? And since like Louis XV was only 5 years old when he took over, the Parlements were able to surge forward and kind of reclaim a lot of their power. And by 1770, Louis XV tries to bring them under control, but since he wasn't able to force the nobles to pay too many taxes, mainly because he died in 1774, right? Now, by 1774, though, he starts agreeing to actually invest and support and finance the growing American revolutionary movement, right? So that is being baited in as well. We'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. Now, Louis XV, though, is going to die at the age of 64 in 1774 without the ability to bring the Parlements under control, and the press are going to eviscerate him, and he lost many different wars, including the War of Austrian Succession, and also including the War of 7 Years' War, including the French and Indian War, lost a lot of colonies, crippling France's ability to pay off a lot of their debts, right? And so when he dies, rule passed to Louis XVI. Louis XVI was only 20 at the time. He had been married for about 5 or 6 years to his wife Marie Antoinette, formerly Maria Antonia, and we talked about how she's from she's a Habsburg Austrian, and basically she was a peace treaty from the 7 Years' War, right? Now we talked a lot about their personalities, right? We talked about how like Marie Antoinette was actually very, very intelligent. She's very oblivious to the plight of a lot of the French people during this time period. When you're looking at the two of these people together, actually, this is during her like little shepherd phase right here. We'll talk about her shepherd phase a little bit in class. Ask me what it is. Be like, hey, what's her shepherd phase you keep talking about? So Marie Antoinette was very, very intelligent, but she did not understand the plight of like regular people in the revolution, right? So it is important to understand that. And we also know that Louis XVI had his own personality deficiencies, right? We talked about how he was obsessed with locks and how like him and Marie Antoinette never conceived a child for quite some time. And then there was like a really awkward interaction between her brother and him and stuff like that. But they do end up starting to have children while they're married before, I think it's after about like 7 years or so, when they're actually king and queen of France. They start having children. They have several daughters up front, and they end up having one surviving son, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI didn't necessarily, like, love each other, but they understood each other, right? And this goes a long way because the people of France loathe Marie Antoinette with a fury, right? They hate her. They hate her so much, and they blame a lot of the country's problems on her rather than blaming them on Louis. Now, the reason being is because she's Austrian. She has been an enemy of France for decades. And now all of a sudden you're supposed to be friendly with them. That doesn't translate well to the people of France, right? There are all these really, really, really lewd cartoons that were coming out in French newspapers, ones that were saying that she was like into women and not into men and like all this other crazy stuff. There's a lot of intense stories about her, including like the diamond necklace affair, which we'll talk about in class as well a little bit, because I don't want to like take up too much time in your flip explaining like her shepherd phase or this diamond necklace issue, right? And all this other crazy stuff. But the big thing about it you have to understand is 20-year-old Louis takes over with his wife Marie Antoinette that the French people hate, and it's just too late, right? So like by this point in 1774, the French Revolution doesn't start until 1789, but you can see it on the horizon, right? We know it's coming just because like the damage has been done. Louis is too soft. He's obsessed with people like loving him. And I don't mean soft to be like toxic masculine or anything. He's just not willing to make the nobles upset. He's not willing to up their taxes. He's not willing to insult the church and up taxes on them or create taxes for them in general. Because he's obsessed with this idea of people loving him. And like he's also obsessed with the idea that he doesn't want to be king anyway, right? So he's like, oh, I wish I didn't have to be king. So as you can tell, we have a lot of issues, right, with Louis. Louis is like struggling with a lot of stuff. He's really, really like got some dysfunctions in a lot of different places. And so a lot of that damage has already been done. And so he's going to do his best to avoid the revolution, but his best isn't quite good enough. And a big reason why is because we're going to take two different movements and we're going to combine these two things together really quick, because we talked about the eroded power of the monarchs, the crumbling ancient regime. Now we got to move into how the American Revolution and the Enlightenment are going to actually help lead to the start of the French Revolution, right? So big thing about it is you've got huge impacts, both practical and practical and ideological. Hey, there it goes. All right, so that include the support of the Americans bankrupt the crown of France, right? So the big thing about it, though, is you have to understand that the French did heavily invest in the victory of the Americans during the American Revolution. The American Revolution starts in 1776, but it had been bubbling up for several years before that, including the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, the formation of the Sons of Liberty, and things like that inside of America. So under the reign of Louis XV, the financing of the American Revolution had already started. So Louis XVI carried that thing forward, and this is going to bankrupt the crown of France because they were thinking, oh, they'll deal a huge economic impact into Britain, so we'll make up some money there, but then also the Americans will eventually have to pay us back. The problem is that the Americans don't have a stable enough financial system right out the gate to pay anybody back, and also the people of France, though. Ugh. So financially speaking, it crippled the crown and their ability to pay off these debts. And the regular people of France see the Americans as this, like, wait a minute, revolution's an option, right? So it plants the seed in the minds of the French people that revolutions are a practical thing, right? And they were like, the Americans are BA. And they believed in the cause of the Americans and the idea of taking your government down, following Enlightenment ideas, and going forward, right? So the thing about it is the American Revolution represents those Enlightenment ideas in action, right? Enlightenment ideals are demonstrated in the American Revolution, both in documents, in practical, and in literal ways, right? And also, speaking of, it's going to infect the mind of even some of the nobility. This guy right here actually helped the Americans win the American Revolution. He is a very famous figure in this entire French Revolutionary series. His name is the Marquis de Lafayette, right? Now, my dog, Pierre, is now the Marquis de Lafayette in this region. He's Pierre, the Marquis de Lafayette. He is descended directly of this Marquis. It's actually really impressive. You can see the resemblance. It's uncanny. Check it out. I mean, dude, they look exactly alike, right? So, now, anyway, but we're not talking about the new Marquis de Lafayette. We're talking about the old Marquis de Lafayette, right? So the old Marquis de Lafayette is right here. And guess who he is? Let's look down here and look at what is in his hand. He is holding his hat, and he has a, what is that? That's a tricolor cockade that shows he supports the revolution later on. Also, what is this? It's a sword. Who are the only people allowed to carry swords? Sword nobles, right? So, he is a member of the nobility. He is a member of the sword nobility, but he's also a supporter of the American Revolution and the later French Revolution as well. He's also a massive supporter of Enlightenment ideas, right? And so the American Revolution enacted Enlightenment ideas, most heavy in general. So let's talk about them really quick. Let's list these Enlightenment ideas that existed in the American Revolution. Now, I know you better be listening to this. You better not have me on mute. I can be on 2x speed. I don't even really care. But you need to know how the American Revolution represented Enlightenment ideas and how the French are going to take those Enlightenment ideas and then try to pull them forward as well. So starting off with the first one, Locke. Locke's ideas are heavily represented in the American Revolution. Life, liberty, property. Literally in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence is life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? So that is sampled directly from Locke's ideas. So the ideas of life and liberty going forward are going to infect the psyche of the French citizens after seeing them successfully happen in the American Revolution, right? Another big one is going to be anti-Hobbes views of absolutists, right? Anti-views of monarchs, because they take the ideas of the Leviathan and then turn it around and say, that is not for us, right? So anti-Hobbes sentiment is going to lead towards the American Revolution, and Enlightenment ideas are going to infect the ideas in the minds of the French revolutionary citizen. Oh, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract theory is going to lead to this idea of how much should a government give? General will. We believe in this revolution and it's over the majority, so we should have these things happen, right? Another big one, Voltaire's ideas of freedom of religious thought. Literally in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, right? So like American Revolution is literally taking the ideas of the Enlightenment and running with them, right? Like the Baron de Montesquieu, separation of powers, right? The American government creates a multi-branch separated government based off the ideas of the Enlightenment. All these things happen. They send the American Revolution forward. The Marquis de Lafayette witnesses them. The French revolutionary citizens are witnessing them in the newspapers that are going around France. And so before the revolution even started in 1789, the French people are like, we could do this. I think we could do this. So the American Revolution is going to lead directly to the French Revolution. And the Marquis de Lafayette, I'm sorry, out of all of these figures, he's one of my favorites. He's just a really good guy. Well, I don't think he's a hero or anything. I'm sure he's like racist and so like not a positive person in a lot of ways. But he's an interesting figure that we get to talk about a lot. So also the last but very not least cause of the French Revolution, probably the biggest log on this fire that would bellow itself into a massive big deal has got to be the financial crisis that's going on, right? So like the absolute inane financial crisis that's occurring is, bananas. So couple of financial crises also with this, a famine. The French revolutionary citizens were having trouble harvesting crops. Famines were running rampant throughout all of France. And bread was actually like not even available. So you've got hungry people with no money, which is going to lead to this.
No dessert? Oh, sure. We'll eat our dinner right after you eat this. Get off of me! Computer, read right here.
Let's just be copper. What's that?
Exactly, right? So the thing about it, though, going forward is, let's talk about that financial crisis, right? So why can't the French government help the French people out who are going through a famine specifically and directly? Well, a lot of it is because guess where 50% of their tax money was going? So I don't know if you understand how loans work, right? So like a lot of these countries during this time period were indebted to each other, right? So like the French government had a lot of money that was given directly to them by other governments so they could go off and fight wars, right? For example, they borrowed a heavy amount of money from Spain. They borrowed a heavy amount of money from their other allies, from Austria and other people like that. There's this thing about loans where you have to pay this thing called interest, which interest is money you give the person for allowing you to take the loan, but it doesn't help pay off the loan at all, right? So for example, if I loaned Claire Kirsch money to buy a new chicken, right? So like, and she was like, give me $10 to go buy a new chicken, and I'll be like, okay, fine, but I'm gonna charge you 1% interest, right? That means she has to pay me a dime every month for just allowing her to have that. 50% of the French tax money paid off just the interest on their loans. The interest, just the interest. That's it. So they're not even paying towards these loans. It's so bad. And then also 25% of the money is going to maintaining the military. That's 75% of all their tax money going to these two different places. 75% as interest on loans and the military. That's bananas. All right, so like that is absolutely ridiculous. And if they just would have upped taxes on the nobles and the clergy, they could have solved a huge issue right here. Now, 6% of the money is going to maintaining the court for the royals, right? Maintaining Versailles, paying for the royals, giving them money and things like that. Now, to give you an understanding, if we took 6% of the money of the modern American tax amount and gave that to just the president, it'd be $440 billion. So, like, you have to understand that 6% is a ton of money of the French, like, tax monies that they're collecting every year to be giving to royals to have parties, right? And so 19%, the other little bit of, like, the money is just left for everything else, to help with the famine, to help the people, to pay off debts and everything else. So this is impossible. No, it is not possible to fix the thing of issues of France with 19% of the tax money. That's insane. The fact that you thought at any moment that 19% of your tax revenue was going to fix a famine, the growing gap between the urban poor and the bourgeoisie, the growing gap between funds to fix the issues with tax credits and tax monies. You're insane. But here's the thing about it. Was Louis XVI aware of this? Of course he was, right? So, like, he was aware that he needed to find money someplace else. So he actually did have several different attempts to fix this whole thing, right? So one of those big ones was this thing known as the Assembly of Notables, right? So the Assembly of Notables happened in 1787, where the old guard of the French financial advisors, it's this guy and this guy, which I can never remember what their names are. It's not Moripeau, but he's like he's the French advisor to Louis XVI during the Assembly of Notables, right? So the earliest Assembly of Notables was called by the French financial advisors. And they were like, let's get a bunch of the members of the First Estate and a bunch of the members of the Second Estate in a room together, not in a parlement, and try to convince them to go out to the other nobles and the clergy and convince them to pay taxes, right? To convince them to up their tax money. The Assembly Notables was a miserable failure. The Assembly of Notables, all those representatives left, not agreeing whatsoever to any upping of tax money at all, right? So the big thing about it, though, is what's going to happen after this is, again, the press is going to go nuts. This right here is a political cartoon from the Assembly of Notables. And this right here is a wolf who represents the monarchy, and these people are supposed to represent the First and Second Estate. And what does a wolf do to like birds and stuff? He eats them, right? So this starts running wild throughout all of the the newspapers, and basically the question says, how would you like to be cooked, right? So like the big thing that happens is a lot of the nobles of the Second Estate and the members of the First Estate are literally like, oh no, we're not paying doodly squat, right? So like, and they refuse. And so what ends up happening is Louis XVI fires his old financial advisors and brings in a very important figure. This guy, a Swiss financial advisor. This dude's election after the Assembly of Notables is very key in the progression forward of the French Revolution. His name is very important. Go ahead and jot this down. So, but after the Assembly of Notables fails, blank is hired as the new financial advisor. His name is Jacques, spelled Jazqueus, Jacques, which is like actually the name I proposed for Pierre at first, but Maria was like, no. So like Jacques, and his last name is Necker, Necker. So Jacques Necker gets actually elected to be the new financial advisor of France. And Louis XVI goes up to him and he's like, how are we going to fix this financial situation? We are falling further and further into debt. We are crumbling at the seams. The Americans aren't paying us back. What should we do, Jacques? Please tell me, what should we do? And Jacques decides to call something. This meeting had not been called since 1614, and the year is now 1789, and Jacques Necker says, Louis, we have to call the Estates General. So what the Estates General is it's this meeting of all of these privileged individuals that have to show up and try to solve the financial crisis of France. Basically, it's an emergency parliament, right? So it's the first time this thing's been called in 173 years. So in 1789 it gets called, or in 1787 it gets called technically, and they start preparing for it. And so in 1787 they begin to call the Estates General, and it hadn't been called since 1614. But what the Estates General is that Jacques has this idea for is he's like, let's call them because it's a representative body that's only called during a time of crisis, right? When public opinion, it was completely necessary, because what they needed to do was they needed to have a huge meeting and a huge showing to get the press to stop eviscerating all of the nobles and royals and to try and bring this tension down a little bit, right? And so this representative body was called, and it literally does not even get off on a very good foot. And the big thing you need to understand about it is the way it works, right? So the way the Estates General works is that the First, Second, and Third Estate have assemblies of representatives representatives that have been picked by their estates, right? So it would be like, hypothetically speaking, if like we've got, I don't know, like if when I'm standing in front of class, so the Dakota Como side of the room would be the first estate, so they're the clergy members. The empty area in the back is going to be the third estate. And then on my right side, we've got all the nobility, which is like McKenna's side of the room. And so y'all are the second estate, right? So y'all would assemble into this hall, and Louis would be sitting up in front of you. And the way it would work is the huge problem. There are 3 representative bodies. They each only get 1 vote, right? So like, the first estate gets a vote, the third estate gets a vote, and the second estate gets a vote. How is this already unfair going into this entire thing? The problem is that who's going to win every single time? The first and second estate. Because they're already showing that they have no intentions of actually, they have no intentions to pay more taxes. So this Estates General, the way it's set up, is actually really, really dumb. And so complaints were running rampant out the gate, right? And I'm talking about crazy amounts of complaints. And do me a favor, underline the complaints and ask me in class, Sabito, I know you're listening, ask me in class, be like, Mr. Terry, what were some of the other complaints about the Estates General? And we'll talk about those things more a little bit forward as we go. But this is what the Estates General looked like when it was assembled, right? So the complaints are crazy, and it's very insulting to the third estate. And the Estates General finally starts in 1789 after those elected were politically different amongst each other, right? So like the big thing about it though is the Estates General started off going pretty well. It started off going pretty well. The early agreements include like that they thought absolutism was lame, right? So like even the first and second estate were like, yeah, the absolutism concept's kind of dumb. We should definitely maybe have a constitutional system or have a document that outlines the powers of the kings and stuff like that. They were like, monarchs are fine, but constitutional monarchs are way better, right? So that's an early agreement. Another early agreement is like, let's do away with mercantilism. Mercantilism's dumb, right? Like, so let's get rid of guilds, let's get rid of all that stuff, and let's go to economic liberalism, like Adam Smith outlined, right? So do away with all that. Another big one, in a document, let's grant some personal liberties, right? Even the first and second estate was like, yeah, freedom of religion probably is a good idea, right? So like, and they were also like, freedom of speech is probably a good idea, and grant personal constitutional laws to the people of France, right? So that's all fine and good, but the disagreements are the things that derail the entire Estates General, right? The biggest one is voting procedures, okay? So you have to understand the way this whole thing works. Since they only get 1 vote, a lot of these early, a lot of the representatives are like, this voting system's dumb. We demand that you double the third, right? So like, write that down really quick. Double the third, okay? See, representative numbers, doubling the third. They were like, why are we going to try to agree on paying taxes more if those two are going to beat the third estate every time in this goofy voting system when we only get 1 vote? And another one was meeting procedures, right? They were like, you are insulting us every day we start this thing because of the way the procedures go. The third estate has to file in last. We're not allowed to wear fancy clothes. We're not allowed to wear black robes and blah, 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 blah. They have a lot of big meeting disagreements. But the representative numbers is the biggest one that the third estates won. They were like, look, let us have more representatives than everybody else because there's more of us in France, and give us 2 votes rather than 1. All right, so we can at least come to a tie that can be broken, preferably, right? So the double the third principle is very, very important. So as you can see, everything was going fine until taxes came up, right? And so when taxes came up, everything got really, really intense. And we're starting to see, though, the dissent of some of the other members of the first and second estate. This moment of the double the third concept, which we'll talk about more when we come back to class, the double the third concept sends waves throughout the entire Estates General. And some of the first estate members and some of the second estate members start looking at the third estate and they're like, man, I think they're right. I think that they have legitimate complaints. I think this is screwed up. I think we have been taking advantage of them the whole time. And all the while, Louis just sitting up front going like, and just literally minding his own business, right? There's this whole event called the Hat Fiasco. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. But the big thing that comes out is a pamphlet. And a pamphlet was written by a first estate member, a man by the name of the Abbé Sieyès, right? So do me a favor really quick, write his name down. Abbey, and then Sieyas. The Abbé Sieyès is a member of the first estate because abbey basically means bishop or cardinal, right? An abbey is like a religious figure. He was a priest, and he wrote a pamphlet, and that pamphlet was called what is the third estate, right? See, as you see, que croissant les tiers estate. So basically what it's saying is, what is the third estate? And he writes this entire pamphlet of, oh, they're this, they're this, they're this, they're that, and he ends the entire thing with the third estate is everything. They are everything. They are our economy, they are our government, they are our base, they're everything. They're our parishioners. They're the people that work for the second estate members. The third estate is everything. So that pamphlet of what is the third estate becomes a huge thing that sends ripple effects through this entire meeting, as you can see, and it's going to lead to a lot of dysfunction, and it's going to make everything even worse, okay? You could say that the Estates General was the stick of dynamite that if it just stays safe, the revolution won't happen. But that fuse keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter every time they can't agree on something. And it's going to get real short when we talk about it in the next class. Because this guy right here, Jacques Necker, who's standing in front of the Estates General, cannot get the man sitting up here, Louis XVI, to help these people or agree on anything. And things start getting crazy, okay? And we'll talk about the craziness in our next class, and I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a great weekend.